COVID-19 and tyranny, the conditions for unsubmission. The worldwide spread of COVID-19 has brought to everyone's attention a great divide between those submitting to a dominant fear-mongering discourse and those unwilling to submit to it. Of the latter, only a few are likely to succeed in their effort to forestall the rise or consolidation of tyranny. The following discussion explores the concrete conditions allowing us to firmly resist any and all erosion of freedom under the weight of the preferred instrument of tyrants, irrational fear, or fear of violent death. Let us take our bearings from a prefatory consideration. Two are the general manners in which people confront problems today. A natural one, whereby we seek out the roots of problems, and a postmodern one, whereby, denying that problems have proper roots, we trust government-sponsored propaganda to account for problems and dominant rules and regulations to tackle our problems. Those who adhere to the first manner of tackling problems are not easily duped today by government-sponsored views. They consequently tend to mistrust dominant rules and regulations as the proper manner to deal with problems. For beyond the scope of postmodern expectations, the appeal to rules and regulations as guides to everyday living tends to foster sham distractions from moral virtue, while government propaganda tends to obscure common sense and straight reason. To make a long story short, either we think or we let other people think for us. Either we live freely or we let other people live our lives as if freedom were discovered in private once we delivered our public life to a higher or alien authority. The man named Natural in the foregoing prefatory remarks senses that freedom is the political problem par excellence, and that those believing otherwise mistake freedom for the dream thereof. For to allow that problems have roots or principles is to expose oneself to them, to face them. Now, thus intended, principles of problems are common rather than private, for they underlie all discrete instances or manifestations of problems. The turn to the principles of problems is then a turn to what is common, a turn incarnating freedom. Here one is free by seeking the principles or solutions of one's problems in public or in what is public, the res publica. Where the republican life is not available, there is no freedom. Thus, we may say that in tribes or empires alike, there is no freedom, whereas it is in cities or city-states alone that we begin enjoying freedom. Cities, and to some extent nations allowing them to thrive, stand as the consummation of tribes compatible with all that is potentially genuine in them, whereas empires stand for the absolute submission of tribal societies. Accordingly, as Giambattista Vico showed well, the Roman Empire failed to subdue or tame ancient, full-fledged cities, not least of them Jerusalem, as it had done with tribal peoples. What is the foremost representative of empire today? Simply put, it is the empire of the universal mercantile society, what is often called globalization. we are speaking of the dominion of a network of multinational corporations thriving upon the reduction of human beings to slaves and enslavers, both bound to the logic of progressive enslavement. In what way are we slaves? By living according to the corporation's dictates, especially as expressed via governmental authority. In what way are we enslavers? By fostering the success of dominant corporations. To be a slave, then, is at once to enslave. Now, who today succeeds in not being a slave? Who is not a collaborationist in a climate in which genuine freedom as the foremost political problem, is repressed as foremost public enemy, as if freedom must be understood as a merely private entity, a rootless, defenseless, utterly vulnerable entity, hapless before the onslaught of tyranny? Our question contains its own answer, of course. Those who are well-rooted shall not be broken. The most vulnerable, on the other hand, include those who have been convinced that man is nothing but a modification of senseless matter, those who have disparaged all covenants with divine transcendence as delusional, all those who have assumed that the only way for politics not to be trampled by divinity is for it to be cut off from it. Yet others, for whom freedom is not its own end, or for whom the ends of freedom are given by nature, and not, for instance, by any official experts pretending to speak for nature as its priest. These others shall stand as a stumbling block for the dictatorship of a global market demanding that our everyday life experience be grounded, if only covertly, in the market's own current, its own evolution. Those people, on the other hand, for whom freedom is its own ungrounded end, in other words, all libertines, people for whom I am free independently of the question of a common good, irreducible to human creativity, well, all such people will be ill-equipped to justify any objection they might raise against the assault waged upon liberty by a technocratic global market. Only those of us for whom freedom is essentially a political problem, citizens, then, in the fullest sense, for whom man is definitely not what our times call a product of evolution, only these people will be, in principle, capable of resisting the mass call to submit to the dictatorship of plutocratic world elites. Those who stand for themselves alone shall surrender their freedom in exchange for slavery masked as private freedom. Those of us who stand for a freedom anchored in something greater than themselves and ultimately than freedom itself, they, as well as their freedom, shall stand as the primary enemy of tyranny. For they are the only ones who will be able to gather adequate resources for viable and sustainable rebellion to tyranny. Now, to speak in generality, public or real freedom is livable only with respect to legal and religious anchorage. Not surprisingly, the firmest protests to present-day assaults upon freedom are being waged in the United States by people appealing to a legal constitution and to the biblical God it presupposes for them. On the other hand, in countries where rules and regulations define the highest standard of moral life, or to the extent that it does, the dictatorship of the caste of official experts thrives without any serious opposition. The only possible solid front against tyranny is built upon solid roots. These entail properly political freedom, or freedom anchored at once in law and divine transcendence, with the understanding that law and divine transcendence support rather than suppress freedom. Political freedom is incompatible with any deus ex machina, or guarantor imposed upon freedom from without. The true God of politically free citizens must be one we may rise to in accordance with the laws guaranteeing our freedom to thus rise. But the ascent to the divine must presuppose, if viable, a descent of the divine to man, or more precisely onto the level of the city, as opposed to either tribes or empires. The descent in question is one onto the plane of freedom itself. The divine must then be manifest in the mode of an incarnation, as the freedom to oppose tyranny and to rise to divine perfection. What we have here is a religiosity for which salvation is neither private nor cosmic or universal, but political in the respect that it sees the otherworldly as incarnated in the political, or the divine as pointing back to the human. The religiosity at hand, in which politics and theology point constantly to each other, forestalls any impulse to leap from tribal life to imperialism, or to abdicate freedom in the name of some practical solution to its needs, as if freedom were best safeguarded where, uprooted from any otherworldly aspiration, conceived now as a mere pretense, it submitted to the progressive reification of lack of freedom, or of slavery, into ever more mediated and subtly insidious, pervasive modes. In sum, the religiosity animating the properly political objection to a global plutocratic dictatorship as a progressive, most enlightened form of tyranny is a religiosity essentially bound to civility. Those trying to understand how to remain free in a time when freedom is alienated into private quarters only to be strangled therein in the name of universal interests, ought to return to the question of religion outside of the schemes and prejudices reducing religion to an expendable addition to politics, as opposed to being integral to any and all citizenship.